Before you were ever taught the story of Eve, before the rib, before the garden, before the serpent, there was another woman. Her name was spoken in whispers for thousands of years, written on clay tablets older than the pyramids, carved into amulets that mothers hung over their newborn children's cradles to keep their babies alive. She appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls. She haunts the pages of ancient Jewish mysticism. She shows up, just barely, in one single cryptic verse of the Bible you were handed in Sunday school. And then she vanishes. One name, one mention, and then silence. Her name is Lilith.
If you are enjoying this so far and learning things you never knew before, take 2 seconds right now, hit subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. That way you never miss when we drop something new.
Now I want you to think about something before we go any further. You have read or been told the creation story your entire life. God made the heavens and the earth. He made Adam from dust. He made Eve from Adam's rib. The serpent tempted Eve, and everything fell apart. That's the story. But here is a question that has haunted biblical scholars, theologians, historians, and archaeologists for centuries. Why does the book of Genesis tell the story of human creation twice? Not once, twice. And not just in 2 different ways, but in 2 ways that completely contradict each other. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, the Bible says, and I want you to listen very carefully, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them." Male and female, at the same time, together. But then you flip a few pages to Genesis chapter 2, and suddenly the story changes entirely. Now God creates Adam first, alone. Then he creates every animal. Then, and only then, does he put Adam to sleep, pull out a rib, and fashion the woman we know as Eve. 2 different creation accounts, 2 different timelines, 2 different women. For centuries, rabbis, scholars, and theologians wrestled with this glaring contradiction in the sacred text. They asked the question that would birth one of the most haunting legends in all of human history. If Eve was made from Adam's rib in chapter 2, then who was the woman created alongside Adam in chapter 1? The answer they arrived at was Lilith. Now here's where the story gets even deeper and darker and more controversial than most people ever realize. Because Lilith wasn't just invented by a medieval Jewish storyteller sitting in a library one afternoon. She is far older than that. Her roots stretch back 5,000 years to the ancient civilization of Sumer in what is now southern Iraq, to clay tablets written in a language that predates the Hebrew Bible by 2,000 years. She was there before Genesis was written. She was there before the God of the Bible spoke light into existence. And depending on who you ask, she was there before Adam himself ever drew his first breath. Today, we are going to trace the full story of Lilith, from her oldest mythological origins in ancient Mesopotamia, through the Dead Sea Scrolls, through the Babylonian Talmud, through the medieval text that finally told her full story, and into the modern world where she has been reclaimed, reinterpreted, and turned into something her ancient creators never intended. This is not just a history lesson. This is not just theology. This is a story about power, about rebellion, about what happens when a woman refuses to submit to a man and what the world does to women like that. This is the story the church didn't tell you, the story that was buried in footnotes and dismissed as folklore, the story of the first woman. Buckle up, because nothing about what you're about to hear is simple, and nothing, not one piece of this, is what you were taught.
To understand who Lilith really is, to understand why her name carries such weight, such dread, such fascination, you cannot start with the Bible. You have to go back much, much further. You have to go back to a place the Bible itself was born from. You have to go to Sumer. Sumer was the world's first great civilization. Around 3000 BCE, 5,000 years ago, the Sumerians built the first cities in human history along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now modern-day Iraq. They invented the world's first writing system, called cuneiform. They created the first laws, the first schools, the first calendars. And among the things they wrote down on those very first clay tablets was Lilith. Her name in Sumerian was Lilitu, or sometimes the class of spirits she belonged to was called the Lilu. And the ancient Mesopotamians had very clear ideas about what she was. She was a wind and storm demon, a spirit of the night, a creature that hunted in darkness. The earliest surviving written mention of Lilith appears in what scholars call Gilgamesh and the Hulupu Tree, a Sumerian epic poem found on a clay tablet at the ancient city of Ur, dating to approximately 2000 BCE. That is 4,000 years ago. The story tells of a sacred tree, a Hulupu tree, that had been planted along the Euphrates River. The goddess Inanna, the Sumerian goddess of love and war, plans to use the wood from this tree to build herself a throne. But when Inanna comes to harvest the tree after 10 years of growth, she finds 3 terrifying inhabitants have made it their home. A serpent has nested at the roots. A thunderbird called the Zu has built its nest at the crown. And in the trunk of the tree, a dark spirit, the Kisakil Lilake, has made its house. Early translators rendered that word as Lilith. She has claimed the tree. She has taken residence in it. She refuses to leave. And when the great hero Gilgamesh arrives and kills the serpent, the thunderbird flies away into the mountains. But what of Lilith? She destroys her own house and flees into the wilderness. Even in her very first recorded appearance in human literature, Lilith is already doing what she will always do. She refuses to be controlled. She chooses the wilderness over captivity. She burns everything down before she surrenders. B-roll: sand blowing through ruins, fire, a lone owl sitting on ancient stone. Now, the ancient Babylonians, who came after the Sumerians and built their civilization on the same land, inherited this mythology and expanded it dramatically. In Babylonian demonology, the Lilitu were a class of female demons specifically associated with the night. They flew through darkness. They were depicted with wings and the talons of birds, like owls. They stood on the backs of lions. They wore horned crowns. Sound familiar? That description matches almost perfectly with the famous Burney relief, also called the Queen of the Night, a 4,000-year-old Babylonian clay plaque now housed in the British Museum in London. It depicts a beautiful, naked, winged woman standing on 2 lions flanked by owls. For decades, scholars believed this image was Lilith. Today, many identify the figure as Inanna or Ishtar, the goddess of love, but the confusion itself is telling, because in Babylonian mythology, Lilith and the great goddesses existed in a shared space. The lines were blurry. The fearsome and the divine were not always separate things. The ancient Babylonians believed the Lilitu flew through the night, seducing men and draining their life force. She was what we would call a succubus, a female spirit that came to men in their sleep. She was also held responsible for killing infants, for stillbirths, for what we today might call sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. Parents lived in genuine terror of Lilith. They wrote her name on clay bowls called incantation bowls and buried them upside down beneath their homes, hoping to trap her spirit underground and protect their children. Hundreds of these bowls have been found by archaeologists across ancient Mesopotamia. Almost every house had one. Let that sink in.
This wasn't fringe superstition, this was the cultural mainstream. Lilith was as real to these people as any disease, any natural disaster, any enemy army. She was the darkness that came for your children in the night. Low pause. Now, here's what is so important to understand about this period of history. The ancient Israelites, the people who would eventually write the Hebrew Bible, did not live in isolation from these civilizations. They were surrounded by them, influenced by them, sometimes conquered by them. The famous Babylonian exile, when the Jews were taken captive to Babylon beginning in 586 BCE, placed the Hebrew people right in the center of this ancient demonological tradition. They heard the stories, they recognized the name, and when they went back to their own sacred texts, they saw a shadow there that they hadn't quite noticed before. A contradiction in Genesis. A woman created at the same time as Adam, a woman who was not Eve, a woman they now had a name for. And once the name attached itself to the biblical text, it never fully let go. The Lilitu of Babylon had become the Lilith of the Garden of Eden, and the story was only just beginning.
Here is where the story becomes something personal, something raw, something that has made people uncomfortable for over 1,000 years and still makes people uncomfortable today. This is the part of Lilith's story that lives in the alphabet of Ben Sira, a medieval Jewish text written somewhere around the 9th or 10th century CE. And it is in this text, for the first time in all of written history, that Lilith is placed in the Garden of Eden as Adam's wife before Eve. Now let me give you the full story, every word of it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He breathed life into the dust of the ground and formed Adam, the first man. And he looked at Adam and saw that he was alone, and that was not good. So God reached into the same earth, took the same dust, the same clay, and he formed a woman. Her name was Lilith. Notice what the story says. She was formed from the same material as Adam, not from his rib, not from a part of him, from the same earth, the same dust, the same divine act of creation. They were made equal. And for a time they lived together in the garden, side by side, in the paradise God had made for them. But then came the conflict. The version of events recorded in the alphabet of Ben Sira is startlingly specific in its details. When Adam and Lilith lay together in the most intimate act of marriage, Adam insisted that Lilith lie beneath him. Lilith refused. Her argument was simple. It was logical. It was devastating. "We are equals," she said. "We were both made from the same earth. Why should I lie beneath you?" And Adam, who could not argue with her logic, did what powerful people do when they cannot win an argument with reason. He went to God and complained. He told God that this woman would not obey him. He told God she needed to be brought back in line. And Lilith, realizing that Adam intended to use divine authority to overrule her, did something that no one, no human, no spirit, no creation, had ever done before. She spoke the ineffable name of God. In ancient Jewish belief, the name of God, the true, unspoken name, the one so sacred that even to say it aloud was forbidden, carried infinite power. To speak it was to access something beyond human permission. Lilith spoke it, and she flew away. She spread wings that no one knew she had, and she rose into the air over the garden, and she flew north to a great cave near the Red Sea, and she was gone, just like that. The first woman in the Garden of Eden, the woman made at the same time as Adam, from the same dust as Adam, had simply left. Now God, moved by Adam's grief and anger, sent 3 angels after her. Their names were Senoi, Son-Senoi, and Sam-Mangeloth. These 3 angels flew to where Lilith was hiding, in her cave by the Red Sea, and they delivered God's ultimatum. Return to Adam, submit to him, take your place as his wife. If you do not, for every day you refuse, 100 of your children will die. And here is the part of the story that stops people cold. Here is the part that makes Lilith one of the most haunting figures in all of world mythology. Lilith looked at those 3 angels. She heard the threat, 100 of her own children dead every single day for as long as she remained in rebellion. And she said, "No." She told them, "I know myself. I know what I was made for, and I know that I cannot return." She accepted the curse. She accepted the grief of losing her children. She accepted the eternal punishment of exile. And she stayed. Think about what that means for a moment. Whatever Lilith is, demon, rebel, symbol, myth, the ancient authors of this story chose to write her as someone who was presented with the choice between freedom and safety, between her own identity and everything she loved, and she chose freedom. She chose herself, even at an unimaginable cost. But the story didn't end there. In her exile, Lilith is said to have become something terrifying. The grief of losing her children, 100 every day, a number that staggers the imagination, transformed her. She became what the ancients feared most in the darkness. She became the queen of demons, the mother of spirits, the seductress who visited man in their sleep and spawned demon children from the union, a way of replacing the children that were taken from her over and over, endlessly. And she became the threat to human children, the figure that bereaved parents blamed for every unexplained infant death, every stillbirth, every child who was there one night and gone the next morning. In the minds of ancient peoples, her grief had curdled into malice. Her loss had become the loss of others. Her exile had become a war. And yet, and this is critical, even in the most hostile versions of the Lilith story, Lilith is never portrayed as stupid, never as weak, never as defeated. Even the angels who confronted her could not force her to return. Even God's curse did not break her will. Even exile, even grief, even centuries of demonization could not make Lilith something small. She was simply too much, too proud, too strong, too free. And when Adam was given Eve, the obedient wife, the one made from his own body, the one who would submit, Lilith didn't disappear. According to later traditions, she watched, she waited, and some say she returned to the garden in a very different form. We'll come back to that.
Now we need to step back from the myth and ask the hard question. The question that, once you ask it, cannot be unasked. Why was Lilith removed? Not just from the Bible, from mainstream religious teaching, from Sunday school, from most pulpits, from most churches and synagogues in the world today. Why does a figure who appears in ancient Sumerian texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Babylonian Talmud, and centuries of Jewish mystical writing get reduced to a footnote, a rumor, a name most Christians have heard but can't quite place? The answer is not simple, and anyone who tells you it is simple is probably trying to sell you something. There are multiple layers here, multiple historical forces, and the truth, as it so often is, sits somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. Let's start with the most basic fact. Lilith is not in the canonical Bible. The Hebrew Bible, and by extension the Christian Old Testament, contains one single word that scholars connect to her, the word Lilit in Isaiah 34:14.
Isaiah 34 is a prophecy of desolation, a prediction of what will happen to the land of Edom when God's judgment falls on it. The prophet is painting a picture of total wasteland, wild animals, desert creatures, and supernatural beings haunting the ruins. Verse 14 in the original Hebrew reads in part, "And the Lilith shall rest there, and find for herself a place of rest." That word Lilith has been translated in wildly different ways depending on the era and the translator's worldview. The ancient Greek Septuagint translated it as a kind of demon or ghost. The ancient Latin Vulgate, the official Bible of the Catholic Church, translated it as Lamia, a child-eating monster. The famous King James Version of the English Bible, produced in 1611, translated it as screech owl, a bird. Just a bird. Pause. Let that irony land. One translation, a bird. Another, a demon. Another, a woman who eats children. The same word, the same verse, the same ancient text. The difference in translation isn't about scholarship, it's about intent, about what the translators wanted people to see and what they wanted people to miss. Now here is where the history gets genuinely complex, because the question of whether Lilith was removed from the Bible depends enormously on which version of events you accept about how the Bible was assembled in the first place. One perspective, held by some scholars and many skeptics, is that Lilith's story was deliberately suppressed, that early religious authorities, recognizing a figure who embodied female independence and equality, made a conscious decision to exclude her story from the canon, or to reduce her to a single ambiguous word in a book about the end of a foreign nation. The argument goes like this. The Genesis text clearly contains two creation accounts. Scholars call them the priestly source, Genesis 1, and the Yahwistic source, Genesis 2. These were written by different authors in different eras, and they were compiled into a single text during the redaction of the Hebrew Scriptures, likely during or after the Babylonian exile. The editors who compiled these texts, almost certainly all men, had to make choices. What stays? What goes? What gets harmonized? What gets left in tension? They left the contradiction. And in leaving the contradiction, they left the door open to the question that gave birth to Lilith's legend. But here's the other perspective, and it deserves equal time. Many serious scholars, both Jewish and Christian, point out that Lilith, as Adam's wife, was never part of official rabbinic theology. The alphabet of Ben Sira, the primary source for the Eden version of Lilith's story, was, by many accounts, a satirical text. Some scholars believe it was written as deliberate parody, mocking both the Bible and rabbinic tradition, not as genuine theological teaching. The Zohar, the central text of Jewish mysticism, or Kabbalah, gives Lilith a role, but not as Adam's wife. There she is the wife of the demon Samael, an evil counterpart to Eve, not a human woman at all, but a primordial spirit. So was Lilith removed from the Bible? The honest historical answer is she was never fully in it. What was removed, or more accurately never included, was the tradition that grew up around that one ambiguous word in Isaiah 34. But whether she was removed or never included, the effect is the same. A powerful, independent female figure exists at the very beginning of the Abrahamic tradition, and mainstream religious teaching has spent 2,000 years making sure you didn't hear about her. And the reason for that, the real reason, comes back to what Lilith represents. She represents the idea that women and men were created equal, that submission is not a divine mandate, but a human imposition, that the woman in Genesis 1, made simultaneously with Adam from the same material, had the same standing before God that Adam did. In a religious tradition built on male authority, on the hierarchy of husband over wife, priest over laity, rabbi over community, Lilith is not just a myth. Lilith is a structural threat. Because if the first woman was equal to the first man,
If she walked away rather than submit, if God sent angels and she still said no, then the entire architecture of patriarchal religion begins to shake at its foundation. And that, not any theological objection, not any historical accident, is the real reason Lilith was buried. She was too dangerous to let live in the mainstream story.
For most of recorded history, Lilith lived in the margins, in the footnotes of theological texts that most people never read, in the incantation bowls buried under ancient homes, in the whispered warnings of mothers over sleeping children, in the nightmares of men who woke from erotic dreams they could not explain. She was the name you weren't supposed to know, the story you weren't supposed to tell, the woman who had been convicted and sentenced without a trial, buried alive in the cultural memory of 3 major world religions. And then, the world changed. In the 1960s and 1970s, the women's liberation movement in the Western world didn't just challenge laws and workplace policies, it challenged stories. It went back to the oldest stories, the founding stories, the stories that set the template for how women were supposed to see themselves, how men were supposed to see women, how society was supposed to be organized. And they found Lilith waiting for them. In 1972, Jewish feminist theologian Judith Plaskow, widely considered the first Jewish feminist theologian, wrote a midrash about Lilith that would become one of the most influential pieces of feminist religious writing in the 20th century. In Plaskow's retelling, Lilith and Eve are not enemies. God and Adam are the ones who have kept them separate, told each one terrible things about the other, used their division to maintain control. But Eve, curious, climbs the wall that separates her world from Lilith's and finds a woman. Just a woman. Not a demon, not a monster, not a seductress. A woman who left because she refused to be less than she was. And they talk, and they become friends. And together they return to the garden, and the story ends with God and Adam watching them come back, expectant and afraid. Expectant and afraid. That line hits differently every time, because that is exactly how power responds when the people it has suppressed start telling their own stories. B-roll, Lilith magazine covers from the 1970s onward, books, academic papers. In 1976, a feminist magazine called Lilith was founded, billing itself as an independent Jewish women's magazine. It is still published today. For nearly 50 years, the name Lilith has served as a banner for Jewish women claiming their own religious and cultural voice. In 1997, Canadian singer-songwriter Sarah McLachlan launched the Lilith Fair, an all-female touring music festival that became one of the most commercially successful festivals of its era. The name was a deliberate choice, a celebration of the difficult woman who refuses to take a supporting role. In 2021, Marvel Comics introduced Lilith as a major character in their supernatural storylines. Video games, television series, fantasy novels, pop music, Lilith is everywhere in contemporary culture. Every generation rediscovers her. Every generation makes her new. But here's what I want you to understand about this modern resurrection of Lilith. It is not just entertainment. It is not just feminism. It is not just rebellion for rebellion's sake. It is a response to a genuine historical wound. B-roll, stained glass windows, old Bibles, empty churches, women praying alone. For thousands of years, the major Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, operated from a theological foundation that placed women in a position of spiritual inferiority. Eve was blamed for the fall. Women were told that their suffering, in childbirth, in subjugation to their husbands, was divine punishment for Eve's original sin. The proper role of a woman, according to centuries of religious teaching, was obedience, submission, silence. And Lilith, who appears at the very beginning before all of that happened as an equal partner who walked away rather than submit, was the theological counter-argument that had to be suppressed. She was suppressed because the story the official religion needed to tell required a compliant first woman. It needed Eve. It couldn't afford Lilith. So where does all of this leave us today? What do we actually know? What is fact? What is folklore? What is truth? Let me give you the clearest picture I can. What is historically documented? The name Lilith, or some form of it, has appeared in human writing for at least 5,000 years, from ancient Sumerian clay tablets to modern academic journals. It appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the most significant archaeological finds in history, as a malevolent spirit to be exorcised. It appears 4 times in the Babylonian Talmud, one of the foundational texts of Rabbinic Judaism. It appears in the Zohar, the central text of Kabbalah. It appears in the medieval alphabet of Ben Sira as Adam's first wife. The word Lilit appears once in the Hebrew Bible in Isaiah 34:14, translated as bird, ghost, demon, or night creature, depending on who is doing the translation. What is mythology and folklore? The specific story of Lilith in the Garden of Eden, her marriage to Adam, her refusal to submit, her flight to the Red Sea, her confrontation with the 3 angels, comes from a text that many scholars believe was satirical and never was accepted as official religious teaching by mainstream Judaism or Christianity. The idea that Lilith was the serpent in the garden is a later tradition with no direct biblical support. What is interpretation? Whether Lilith is a demon, a proto-feminist icon, a symbol of female power, a cautionary tale, or simply a fascinating piece of ancient mythology, that is a question that each person who hears this story has to answer for themselves. But here is what cannot be disputed. The story of Lilith is the story of a question that the official narrative refused to ask. What if the first woman was equal to the first man? What if she refused? What if no one could force her to change her mind? And what did we do to women like that? B-roll, a lone woman standing in an ancient landscape. Wind, dust, sky. Slowly she turns, and she is smiling. For 5,000 years, we called her a demon. We blamed her for infant deaths. We carved her name on clay bowls and buried them upside down. We hid her in footnotes. We translated her as a screech owl. We told our children not to say her name. But she never died. She never submitted. And she never stopped being the most interesting woman in the oldest story ever told. Her name is Lilith. And now that you know her story, you'll never read Genesis the same way again. If this opened your mind, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and tell me in the comments, does Lilith's story change how you read the Bible? I want to know.